Welcome to What We Made Possible, the podcast where we explore the power of healing and driving change for advocates, leaders, and change makers. The conversations here draw the connection between creating new possibilities in the world, possibilities of care, of belonging, of thriving for our communities, with stories of personal healing and loving relationship building. I'm your host, Patty Dayleg, leadership coach for social change. I spent a decade in nonprofits, government, and DEI, securing 6- and 7-figure opportunities for communities of color. And I've experienced firsthand the transformative power of compassion, healing, and belonging in making a bigger impact. Let's dive in. Dr. Diana Hernández, a tenured associate professor at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, is the founding principal investigator of the Energy Equity, Housing, and Health Program and the co-director of the Energy Opportunity Lab at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Dr. Hernández is a pioneering sociologist and leading authority on energy insecurity, a concept she defined and operationalized through groundbreaking mixed methods research. Rooted in community engagement and policy innovation, her work addresses systemic barriers to energy access for disadvantaged populations and tests promising interventions. She is the author of Powerless, The People's Struggle for Energy with Jennifer Laird, and it's the first major book on energy security in the U.S. Welcome, Diana. You were one of the inspirations for this podcast, like generally, and like what it's called is What We Made Possible, right? Because I think when we reconnected that summer, what was it, 2023? I said that you had this like profound impact on me when you were sharing your wealth story to us in that class 10 years ago. And that stuck with me. And I want to share with you, actually, I had an appointment with that same bank that you were talking about yesterday because they were like, hey, do you want to upgrade your like business accounts? Like you've gotten to that point, right? Where we want to upgrade and like give you some security and whatever. So that also felt like a full circle moment because it was like, oh, like we're talking about wealth and we're talking about like what are the possibilities, right, for people who look like us. And the first time that I have ever seen like a young Latina woman from the Bronx, right, talking about and just like really owning wholeheartedly that like you are a housing practitioner, you own property, you have wealth that needs to be managed, that like broke my brain open because that was not the idea of like who in my mind of who has that kind of resources. So I just want to say thank you again for saying that all those years ago, because it did open up like this idea of what is possible.
Well, first of all, Patty, I'm just so proud of you. I feel like, for the longest time, to basically be an instructor, a mentor, like someone that is like part of the development of other human beings and invested in their knowledge acquisition and like even just being a visual role model of what they can be. I think that that's like such an important role that we can all play in our respective lives. Of course, I'm a professor, and so I get paid to do this. And then I think sometimes I overshare just because, like I think at that point when we first interacted in the classroom, Patty, like I was like very much in the thick of it. I always think of like these different like moments in my life, and I can break them down sometimes based on like what school I was attending, or now like in my adult life, like what phase I was in. And when we interacted 10 years ago, that would have been 2013, 14, 15, around then, I was like very much getting dusty in the mornings before I went to my real job. I had all kind of like sheetrock debris, and I had a real big intention of doing two things at the same time. And those two things were basically reinvesting in my community and doing that via housing, and specifically by way of vacant properties that were just in poor shape, like, that they had been the victims of the homes themselves of deferred maintenance and lack of investment. And some of that was about like how policies kind of trickle down to a specific address, and that, people were locked out of banking and financial opportunities that would have allowed them to like reinvest in their properties and or have jobs that gave them enough of a cushion to do that. And at that point, I was starting my career. I had really no other kind of obligations. And my intention was to do this reinvestment. But I had also, in my early 20s, been a student of wealth creation, really, and financial management. And I studied sociology very deeply, connected to issues around urban poverty and social inequalities. And yet I was also studying, and at that point, I want to say like preaching, particularly to my students, the idea of financial independence and pathways to financial security and wealth. Like, because I believe that our communities deserve that and we have the capacities to build wealth. And oftentimes we've built it for other people, but many times we haven't necessarily thought of ourselves and positioned ourselves as the beholders of our own the wealth that we create, like, and that we do that on an independent basis. And that was a moment in my life. Now I have to say that I'm in a different moment in my life, and I'm really grateful for it. We were talking about what's behind me, and I have like all this artwork from my now 4-year old, because I'm in that phase of my life. And it's very interesting to me that I reached a point of satiation. And I say satiation because, with wealth, it is kind of, you could be really unlimited and ruthless around how far you take it. But I think the further and further and further you go, the more likely you are to be in those like tepid waters, like, around making decisions that are not based on the betterment of place, people, community, etc. And so I reached a point of satisfaction where, like, I'm just not really as motivated by like increasing my wealth portfolio and my real estate portfolio and all that stuff. And I feel like I'm logging into the things that matter to me at this moment in my life. And that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in being financially secure, but I do think that there's a difference between being comfortable, being secure, and then being outright greedy. And it's like, well, at what point do we ever question the morality of ambition? And in my own life, when I made certain choices, I realized like I have enough. I'm enough, and I don't necessarily like in acquiring more. I'm not sure that my circumstances will materially change so much that like let there be space for others, I guess, is kind of where I got in, like where I landed on that.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I think that is something for the folks who were in that classroom, right, for whom that message really resonated, like me. When you're at the point where you see someone who's in that phase of wealth creation, of wealth building, you don't think of it like that, right? But you are thinking of what is that, what would that wealth be for? And what I think I hear you saying is that you've reached the point where that work reached it's doing what you meant for it to do, right? You are able to build for your community, contribute to community. You're able to have this home where you can put art on the ceiling, right, from for your child, and that is enough. I'm so curious what it would look like for more people to have that satiation, like to know like, oh, I'm satisfied by this and it doesn't have to be more. But I also want to name that I think that that's because you weren't looking at wealth for wealth's sake, right? You weren't just like looking at the accumulation of money just to have it. It was for a specific purpose. And now that you're like, oh, there's a different purpose now, I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when you learn how to build things, and I mean like from the ground up, then at some point, you kind of come to a place where you're like, all right, I've built this. That's why a lot of like
Uh-huh.
entrepreneurs are serial entrepreneurs because they kind of like, all right, like I did this, that's cool. Like I'm on to the next question, I'm on to the next issue, on to the next challenge, right? And as I kind of thinking about these different places in my life, at that point, I really wanted to do the proof of concept work around reinvesting in communities and like, what does it take for people that are educated, upwardly mobile, financially secure, to connect to communities of either their origin or that are kind of similar, if that applies. And I think that that was interesting, but simultaneously I was building up my academic career.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually like doing the housing work that gave me, it was much more tangible and it gave me a lot of confidence. And like, I just was able to like apply a lot of that, like project management and like the feeling of like success in closing something out to then building out a pretty successful research portfolio. So I established a program in the school that I'm in, the Mailman School of Public Health, and you're an alum at Columbia. And then I also simultaneously basically launched this Energy Opportunity Lab, which is at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And the whole goal was then to apply a lot of the ideas around building stuff to a program of research. And I think very specifically to an issue area around energy insecurity that I know to be very important and I know to be very consequential. And a lot of, I've written many papers on this and whatever, but I did this kind of big project that ultimately ended up being this new book. And like the goal there was, if you're a builder and you know how to get stuff done, then that can apply in a lot of the different areas of your life. Or, in my housing, as a housing practitioner, that was about, redeveloping small housing projects and then benefiting in many ways financially, but it was an investment. It's not like this was a no cost type of situation. And then also saying like, I know how to do this and I can do this in other realms. And then it just becomes about unlocking leadership. And what does it mean? That's where I am right now. Like, so I feel like I've built out a pretty interesting, set of, let's say, scholarship, and I've been very successful in getting, funding and, like doing all the things that like make any person a successful academic. And right now, where I am in my life is like, I'm building a little human, of course, my daughter, and like, making sure that she's, like has exposure to good values and principles, like, I mean, I will have my metric for success in being a mom is actually to like raise a decent human being that is self-sufficient. Like to me, that is the metric, and whatever, like professionally or, like all those things, like that's up to fate in many ways, or it's up to like her decisions. But that to me is the metric of success. But the other place that I feel very now strongly about building is other people. And that is really, in my mind, about investing in their development, investing in their knowledge base, believing in them, setting them up, sponsoring and championing them. And someone called me recently an OG. And I was like, damn, man, like, I'm not ready to be called an OG. Like, goodness. But actually, to be honest, I mean, I have been at this for a minute. My proudest moments now are these full circle moments like the one that we're having today, where it's like, you were in my classroom, like, and it happens to be that, you've taken a circuitous path and now you're like in this like energy environment, like developing people, consulting, building out, like a platform to talk about possibilities, like, all of these different things. And then you're inviting me as a guest. Like, what a beautiful thing as someone who like taught interviewing skills and like all that stuff for us to be like in conversation again, where you're leading the conversation and the interviewing. And so, like, in this phase of my life where it's really about leadership as service and leadership as investment in the development of human capital, that is, like, I mean, I feel like it's a blessing and it's just an interesting place to be where it's not really about me and it's just really about like the next generation, coming up and knowing that they have OGs that are behind them, supporting them.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have so many follow-up questions. It's so interesting to be called an OG in this work. I think like one of the reasons why I wanted to take your class in particular, because I think maybe we had a choice, right, in who would lead us in kind of these learning these methods, was that you were young, you were a native New Yorker, that you had this kind of on the ground, right, experience, and to now be like, wow, if you're an OG and we've known each other for a decade, what does that mean for the rest of us? Speaking of possibilities, there's a question that I want to kind of bring to every conversation on this podcast, which is what is within your realm now? What are you doing? What are you experiencing now that a younger version of you didn't think or know was possible?
That's a good question. I mean, look, I think, to be honest, I feel like I've always been, kind of ambitious. And ambitious not necessarily because like I just was like, oh my God, this is egotistical. Like I think it was just like an ambition because I always felt like things could be different and things could be better. If I'm honest about what that looks like, I would probably say that things are hard and they take time. And I think consistency and commitment are really critical tools. And nobody really taught me that. I think it's, like staying true and staying with stuff is a part of how you get to, in hindsight, like have reflections on success and have reflections on impact. I think it's like when you're in the middle of it, I think sometimes, it's hard. And I think sometimes when it's hard, like it's really tempting to pivot, to do something else, to like be exhausted, burnt out, and like just feel like you can't keep going. But we could go through hard things and they shape us and they make us better. And that there's beauty in like in the in-betweens. And I don't know that like many years ago I would have appreciated the fact that whatever the outcome, and it may be a different outcome than the one that you were invested in or had envisioned, it's going to be okay. Like that's, I think, for starters. And I think the other part of it is that, things kind of like magically work out. And part of that is that you have to have faith. You have to have confidence in yourself. You have to have faith in the process and just be kind of patient and committed. Paciencia y fe, right? Like that, there's a song in the Heights. And I think it's very telling. Like, I think that there is something very grounding about like a little bit of those insights. And again, I think for many of us when we're, a little younger, so, I'm in my early 40s, so it's not like I'm like that old, but I did start a lot of the work very young relative to where other people start. And so, like, I think there's a little bit of seniority, not necessarily based on chronological age, but just based on experience. And I think that there's something to be said about like there's just a lot of energy when you're young and you just want to like get stuff done. And it's just really about like, like let's just push. And it's funny because like as you get older, you slow down naturally. I think that that's just like anybody who's kind of gotten older will tell you that. But you also focus in on the stuff that really matters. And I think that that's where possibilities are. I think the possibilities are actually in the in between space between having the charge of youth and the patience that's developed, and the sense of sifting out what's most important as you get older.
Mm. Yeah, there's like it's a little possibility is a little bit of a portal, right? You're not here, but you're also not there. And it's its own kind of unique space. That's so interesting to hear. I'm very curious. Okay, so first of all, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in this book, and before we started recording, we started to talk about how it's very easy to just start to jump to solutions. And there are a lot of people who are very committed to solutions, particularly in the energy space and sustainability and kind of like helping people along with the planet. But you really were committed in your book to naming like what actually is the problem and what problem are we solving for. I think because you've named this problem and you've given a lot of meat to it, of talking to actual people about what actually are they experiencing, you've opened up this possibility now of how do we solve this problem differently. So I'm curious how you're experiencing this moment right now as your book just released and what you see for the future. And then I want to talk a little bit specifically about some of your ideas in the book.
Yeah, thanks for noting that. And I mean, yeah, I think the goal. So first of all, I've been sitting with this book, talk about things that like, with patience. I initially did the field work for this book in 2018, and it was like in proposal mode. I think in the 2016, 2017 academic year thereabout. So I have been sitting with this for a long time. And, the different iterations that a book takes, I mean, part of it is the data collection. In this case, I had done 100 interviews with impacted people that experience different energy issues. And then also with a number of like key informants around the country, 10 different places. I also designed a survey with my co-author. We analyzed the residential energy consumption survey, which is a national data set. So it's a really comprehensive take on the issues. It's the deepest dive, the first book on this issue, really taking up the space to say, listen, you may not necessarily see it because it happens behind closed doors, but it doesn't make the experience of energy insecurity any less hard and any less consequential from the perspective of public health, for sure, but also from the perspective of like social isolation and even like the fatalities that come for households that are, like the most susceptible to these issues, either because they're older, they're in poorer health, or because, there's like a building wide fire because somebody had their heating on because or they're using their stove for heat, these kinds of issues, right? So I wanted to give voice to an experience that is really hidden. It's hidden in plain sight in many ways, but I call it America's hidden hardship. So how do you like shed light on something that, operates in in the privacy of people's homes, or even like in a bill that like, is unpayable and that eventually becomes a disconnection. And I think I felt really obligated, and I just felt a special responsibility to tell this story and to tell it from the perspective of people. Like, yes, the data really matters, and the statistics help to like just really show how ubiquitous the problem really is, that it really does touch many millions of Americans in the US for sure. I mean, we actually estimate that 10% of the US population is directly impacted by energy insecurity, meaning that they have an underlying financial hardship, and then any number of the other indicators, either coping or housing related, or also power outages, which is a kind of an addition to the work. But then also 40% are presenting not necessarily with an underlying financial hardship, but are dealing with some of these other things. So that means that 50% of the US population has had an insecurity experience. And, one of the things that we highlight in the book is, look, while this issue might not have gotten a lot of attention, I think when you see it and you understand its components or its essential elements, which is the language that's used in the book, then it will be actually difficult for you to unsee it. And I think people will either be able to lock in and say, you know what, I've actually had these kinds of experiences in my lifetime, or I can see it, much like when a doctor is trained, they can properly diagnose a set of conditions as, something. Then I think the whole point of this book is actually to be able to equip readers with a sense of like, what are the symptoms? What are the essential elements? And then how do we diagnose this properly so that then you have like effective treatment plans, right? If you don't do that diagnosis work, then anything that looks like a treatment plan might be either incomplete or misguided and mistargeted. And I think that the whole point of this book is to say there's so many people that are really actively working on solutions, want solutions, are driven by, the quest to solve an issue. But I don't actually think that we've done that critical foundational work to get us to the place where we can actually make those proper prescriptions, no less the delivery of the treatments and interventions.
Yeah. This idea of energy insecurity, I feel like it's part of it is so hidden because it's so shameful, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what does it look like? What are the symptoms? What does it mean to be energy insecure? We might have heard the words food insecure, right? And to hear these two words together, energy and insecurity, it's intuitive, but I would love to hear what you heard from people. Like, what are those stories? And I'm sure people will, hear a little bit of their story in that if half of us in the US are experiencing this.
Yeah. Such a good question. And I would say that, first of all, I have stories for days, just, and they're all really like featured in different ways throughout the book. I mean, you asked, what does it feel like? And I'm just one of the anchor stories in the book is the story of Alicia, who's a mom, and she's like in her mid 30s. She had a work limiting back injury, and there were things about, she lived in Memphis in public housing, and her experience was one of like an unaffordable bill that had reached the point of like her being on the cusp of a shutoff. And then I met her in the county like energy assistance office, where she signed up for help and she was able to avoid a shutoff at that point, right? But the underlying like conditions that got her there were the fact that she was never really able to pay a full utility bill. Every month it was like a partial payment, and that partial payment started to accumulate into debt, and the debt accumulated and it kind of escalated to the point of being threatened with a utility shutoff. And in her own personal history, she had lived through a utility shutoff. And again, it wasn't necessarily like her sense of responsibility was more for her children than for herself. And she just felt incredibly bad about the fact that her children had to live without heat, without power, in the dark, and, like all of those things. And so that's the backdrop on the economic side. On the coping side, she was asking her dad for help. Of course, she turned to this office for help. But more often, she was like making trade-offs and difficult decisions between replacing her son's sneakers that had holes in them and actually paying the utility bill. And again, having been penalized with a disconnection, she was like, listen, I am going to patch up your sneakers, but we have to have the lights on, right? And then there were all of these other, then, in the actual housing environment, she just talked about her light bulbs, her sockets popping, and the fact that, she lived in a housing complex where, like it wasn't safe, and they put the air conditioning unit out on the porch, and it was just taken in daylight. And so like all of a sudden that action probably also like made under the circumstances of like financial duress or whatever, meant that her family didn't have an air conditioning unit, and Memphis gets really hot. So she would go to this older woman's house and let the kids roam around, and she's like, like it's such a relief that this place, they could go to any room and it's comfortable in any room. Meanwhile, they were sleeping in the living room, the whole family with the stove open, and like using the stove for heat pretty much throughout the winter. So there's just like these like big, her situation was layered because actually she met many of the criteria for a really chronic and intense form of energy insecurity. So not everybody experiences it in this like kind of robust way, but many people have like different iterations of that. The affordability challenges, or a home that is thermally uncomfortable, sometimes actually like unsafe from a temperature perspective. And then the other piece of it is all of the things that people do to what we call prevent an unaffordable bill or respond to the different like conditions. And so, I think ultimately the story is about like all those different elements. But with Alicia's story in particular, talk about possibilities. There's one section in the book that talks about triaging energy insecurity. And the idea is like if we had a comprehensive way to deal with this layered and complex problem, what would that mean for Alicia and her ability to actually like participate more fully in society? Like what would she be doing if she was relieved of those burdens, right? And I feel like we it was an exercise and it's stated as such. But to me, that was like also part of like the reimagination of what solving a problem like this would actually mean on a human scale.
Mm. How are we solving this problem right now? Right there, I think I heard you say that there's assistance programs. Folks are coping in certain ways, right? Like we in my house growing up, we wouldn't put the air conditioner on below 70 degrees unless it was like particularly hot that day, right? Or like you have to turn off the light every time you leave the room. You can't turn it on. So there's ways that we individually are coping, and it feels like, oh, this is just on us. But as a public health practitioner, as a sociologist, you say, no, this is a collective problem. So I'm curious, like, in what ways are we at the collective level trying to solve this? And how would it look different if we did take this kind of like holistic approach?
Love the question. And I just want to say that this is a structurally rooted problem. And, we opened up talking about like housing and, what we need to do about housing. And I think a lot of the ways that we have tried to tackle this have been in like piecemeal with a piecemeal approach. So some of it is about housing improvements and weatherization, and more recently on like housing decarbonization, where there have been a lot of a lot of issues because a lot of the homes that have been so deeply disinvested in need a lot more investment and attention than a lot of our programs are equipped to provide. And the resources are often incomplete. So we just take the tax credits. that have been made available for installing heat pumps. Again, really laudable. That's an efficient, way of heating and cooling. It provides both heating and cooling, and will have, like, you know good outcomes from an emissions perspective. But a lot of the homes that, like, of the people that I was interviewing, would not be in a position. You'd have to upgrade all of the electrical. You'd have to, do a couple, anything that's related to, let's say, installation of a heat pump, with insulation, weatherization, like some of the fundamentals. Like, it wouldn't be that you could just, like, fast forward to electrifying, these homes. So that's been a little bit of, like, the ways that we've been dealing with it. And the other way that we've been dealing with it on the bill side and on the affordability side is primarily through energy assistance. The biggest federal program, and the one that states primarily rely on, is called the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. So LIHEAP is good, and it's meant to offset the utility bills and expenses for any given household. But it's not without its challenges in terms of actually applying and receiving the help. So there's a lot of different kind of eligibility criteria that's, sometimes, mandated. There are federal guidelines, but then states have their own, like, levels of jurisdiction on, the parameters for eligibility. I mean, sometimes just showing up to these offices is a pain in the butt, and not knowing whether or not they're actually going to help you, losing work, having to drive around to a million different places, like all of these things that make it really burdensome. And only 17% of the US population actually receives energy assistance among the eligible households. So you also have a very small pool, like I would call them, like, almost like lottery winners, that they're so lucky. And the program itself is really crisis oriented. So it's not uncommon for people to turn to LIHEAP when they're facing a disconnection. So in public health, we focus on prevention, but the way that these programs are designed is that they are crisis response based. So when you think about, like, the whole collection of things, and, the fact that, a lot of the work isn't, the parlance in the field is, like, braided and stacked. It means that people will get a little help here, but not that other help. And then, and it's like, well, no, actually, if they're showing up and they need help, they might need, like, a lot of different, like, supports for them to get to a place where, they could be self-sufficient, right? Like, if that's the ultimate goal. So in the book, there's an action framework that we present called the Sparked Action Framework, which is an acronym for survey screening and public health surveillance, because we really do need better data infrastructures to be able to manage, to be able to, like, estimate prevalences and, in different places and that kind of stuff, but also to manage it. Because we can't monitor, we're not monitoring it. How could we make improvements? And then the other piece is around participation in the energy governance and energy decision making, affordable bills, and that might look like having low income rates. That is one thing that, we have this kind of equal means fair, and, actually, like, the fact that, like, people across very different income bands are paying the same amount per kilowatt hour, I think is highly problematic and makes it almost impossible for low income households to be able to afford their utility bills. And then a robust energy safety net, we need to rethink that. Knowledge, so energy literacy, electrification, energy efficiency, clean energy access, and all of the different possibilities that renewable energy actually presents in terms of altruism, philanthropy, and energy pantry. These are some of the ideas that are in the book. And then lastly, disconnection reform. Like, I think we have to really question ourselves as a society about whether or not disconnections are a viable way to address energy affordability issues. And much in the same ways that criminal justice has seen reform, and a shift away from, like, strong penalties, and especially for criminal activity that's really rooted in these structural problems. Like, I think we really do have to reimagine how we deploy disconnections. And I'm not a big fan of like universals, because I think, having a universal disconnection ban might not necessarily get us to where we should be, but I do think that we need a lot more protections for households that are meeting with, different vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's a completely different orientation to this problem. Instead of solving for helping folks who are like right at the crisis point where they're right about to lose, right about to be disconnected, or and penalizing them once they get there, it's how do we approach this so that folks don't even get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's like showing up to the doctor with stage 4 cancer.
Mm.
10% is the same prevalence rate for cancer, diabetes, and energy insecurity. But what we do with diabetes and cancer is say, do preventive care, focus on a lifestyle, get your screening in periodically. When you reach a certain age, when we know that you're more at high risk, like, take care of yourself in these ways. We can take care of you better if it's an early stage situation. With energy and energy assistance, we say, come in with your utility shut off notice, and then we'll be able to help you. Well, that doesn't really afford people the opportunity to, like, benefit from all of the preventive ways that we can do the work. And in some ways, like, one of the proudest things that comes out of this book is this new imaginary around how we think about the safety net. The safety net is not only broken, it's been substantially weakened in the current administration, and I think very intentionally so. And so when we come out of this, I like to think about rainbows and like what happens after a storm. When the storm meets the sunshine, you get rainbows, and there's something extremely beautiful about that. But knowing that storms are inevitable, right? And like life has its kind of ups and downs and what have you, we need to be thinking about sturdy umbrellas. How do we provide coverage, not an anchor for when people are falling, right? Or like the safety net, like, just, because they've fallen already, and like we're gonna catch them a little bit, that they just kind of like toppled over. But like, how do we actually let them stand, like grounded, and still have coverage as you would in using a sturdy umbrella? And I think that imaginary, I think, is important, because I think that's what comprehensive approaches offer, is like that, you need the different lines, because when you think about what an umbrella actually does, it's anchored by a lot of different, like, connecting, what's called spokes, I guess. But that's the thing that makes it strong. It's not that it's just one, it's not that it's just the pole and nothing else. It's actually like the thing that provides cover and shield is a combination, and a web, right, of the materials kind of coming together and fusing at a central point. I think that that's kind of what we need. I think that, as we reimagine our economic systems, I mean, our political systems, so many different aspects, I think we really need to be more considerate of the concepts of coverage as opposed to safety nets.
Yeah, I think in your launch you talked about having the sturdy umbrella instead of the broken safety net. And I think there's a component here because it is multi-spoked, like you said. There's power and there's agency in all, like, wherever you stand under the umbrella or whatever part of the umbrella you are. And the book is called Powerless. So I'm curious about your reflections on power and what that means for the individuals, for decision makers, for leaders in this work, for leaders who are like, "Oh, I'm hearing this term for the first time and I this is my experience." Where's the power in that as well?
Yeah. I mean, look, powerless, I think, is strong. It has kind of two connotations, right? I mean, in the context of energy, it could be about just like not having it. But, there's also this idea that, like, vis-a-vis structures that are meant to like suppress, oppress, and like are not necessarily to the benefit of people that present with vulnerabilities. Like powerless is a feeling too. Like, and I think that many of the people that I encountered in this work, they felt powerless, vis-a-vis the utility companies, the, lack of support, like not necessarily knowing where to go and how to take their issues, like their housing issues, like landlords and like all of that. I think that, there's power, there's two sides of the coin, right? And in many ways, this book elevates the narrative of people that are in many ways without power, but also in other ways rendered powerless by heartless institutions, right? And heartless decision makers or people that are uninformed, let's say, if we want to be graceful about it. But I do think that there's actually that other side of power are people that are making decisions where they're privileging certain things, right? Where they're privileging, like, not only profits, as in, like, but just with growth. And there's always more to get. And the shareholders are not satisfied. Like, you have to get more and more properties, even though you can't really tend to them well. Because the same place where we started, which was about satisfaction and reaching the point of satiation, is precisely that, like the work, and that's very internal work that corporations don't do, that individuals with lots of power don't do, where, because the signal is always do more, get more, be bigger, have more, be more profitable. But at what cost? And I think that this book kind of like, I think it really is just a wake up call about at what cost can utilities be so profitable? At what cost can like housing that is so dilapidated and deferred maintenance and all that stuff, like there's a human cost to that. And I think this book is really about sharing those experiences, first of all, to destigmatize, to bring it out into like the, into to more visibility so that people that are experiencing these issues can find power in their voice and find language to describe what it is that they're experiencing so they move forward knowing that this is evidence based and that the people that are in positions that can either regulate and oversee or are otherwise like kind of intending to support the human cause, like now have a way of explaining, expressing, and championing this particular cause.
Yeah, you can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. I just want to read one sentence from the book from your chapter on shifting the power dynamics. You say, just as human decision making led to the creation of these conditions, it's in our collective power to correct these injustices. And I think you've given such language, like you said, to that injustice. It is something that so many of us experience, whether it is to a tiny degree we're at risk of it, or we're like Alicia, who is really at that last kind of stand. So thank you so much for naming this problem, for really giving it story, because I think, when we talk about power, it's very much, I think about my emails from in New Jersey, it's PSCNG, and the email is just about, oh, this is your usage, right? And I'm literally just a kilowatt hour, right? But what you have done in this work is to say, what is the impact of that and what does that look like in real life, right? Like you're making really difficult decisions between patching shoes, buying new shoes, and keeping the lights on. That is something that it's wild to me that it has not been articulated yet. And I think it took someone who did see this, right? Like a housing practitioner who like was a who is a person who has tenants, right? To to really name this because you are, I don't know if you yourself experience energy insecurity. We didn't talk about that, but that you have talked to so many people about it. You've seen, I'm sure, your community experience it. So yeah, thank you for naming this.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you. Thank you for like, of course, the support and the encouragement and the recognition, right? Because I think in some ways, I always say recognition is the first step to justice. And, recognizing a problem is like how you come to a place where you can have justice at the end, right? Where that can be an ambition. But if you don't recognize the problem, I think it's not even viable to hope for that. And I grew up in Section 8 housing, but to be honest, like I, you know, and I think because I grew up working class, but in a very impoverished neighborhood, when I heard the people in the first study that I ever did on this, it wasn't actually about this. It was like I call it an incidental finding, where I was looking for something else and found this thing, and then this is the follow up. The book is the follow up, but basically, I was just sensitive to the idea that like, what they're saying is real and is undocumented and like in like kind of the public record, the academic record, and yet like we can't keep ignoring this. And I just felt like like sometimes that's kind of what it takes too. That's where I am in my career right now and in my life is like I understand now that I have a lot of privilege and different like points of access. And when I was younger, I had that as a student and I was documenting this issue and I wrote the papers and I did all this stuff and I wanted to I just believed folks. Like, and I feel like sometimes, when we think about honoring individual paths, like we don't always listen and respect what we're hearing and what we're seeing. But in that exercise of like trust and believe, I was able to, I think, unlock a reality and then write about it and also like reap professional dividends from just keeping it real, but also like trusting my people. And I think that there was like, I just feel like sometimes like we're conditioned to assimilate and acculturate and integrate and, whatever. But I think that if we lose some of those sensibilities, it doesn't allow us to speak from those positions of like empathy, connection, like realness. And I think that I'm just so proud of like still being authentic and real despite having on paper like a lot of like, privilege and success.
Yeah. I mean, you just gotta like that groundedness, that like being able to hear someone's story and believe them and say like, hey, Columbia University, like this is a real problem that like we need to address and listen to and document, is yeah, you're just so real for that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and just like, and I just want to kind of end with this like reality that, a lot of times, us people of color are innovating because we innovate from a different space, right? And then it's very tempting for, you know, folks in the mainstream and, whatever to co-opt a lot of our work and a lot of our ideas. And as a victim of that, and as someone that like just kind of experienced, like misappropriation and what have you, like I still think it's important that we, fight for our own dignity and that in like I always think that writing this book, having experienced what I think of as like a huge violation and disrespect, gave me all kinds of inspiration to make sure that I was even deeper in the experience and in the responsibility of like telling the story and telling it right and telling it from a place where it's undeniably authentic. And that I think is important. Again, we're challenged in different ways just by virtue of who we are and what we represent and how we're valued in society. But I think we ultimately get to determine our own value, and we ultimately get to determine like how we present ourselves and how we represent in our work. And so this is a testament to like fighting back, both in the small acts of resistance and in the large ones, and in reclaiming power in different ways, and knowing that like we can do it and our outcomes may not necessarily be what we always anticipate and expect, but the process itself is important and it shapes us.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. It's so, we get to a level of success, and it's important to name that like some people will try to, take that from us, say it's theirs, especially as folks of color, as women. So thank you for naming that, because that is such a real experience. I'm curious, what are you looking forward to next? Any projects? Is it more sharing of this book?
I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to like having a lot of conversations about the book, and just, like helping people to just be more aware of the circumstances, and hopefully that like, it took a lot to like put pen to paper on this. And so I really hope that that comes through. But the other part that I'm hoping for is action, and like getting the action framework to come alive in different places, and partnering with, governments and other entities to be able to get to the place where like they're experimenting with some of the concepts and ideas. And like we have some of that going now, and I'm really looking forward to doing more of it, because to me the translational work, that's like, where my practitioner personality is like, all right, I think we have a good handle on, the research, but like what do we do about it? And coming from a community of need, like I never thought that that knowledge for its own sake was enough. And that, really thinking about how do we translate that knowledge into like real world impact is so critical. So that's what I'm really looking forward to. And then to doing that, not alone, but like also by investing in the next generation, and like, just continuing to support and shape the field, because I'm investing in human beings that will end up being leaders in their own right.
I'm sure there are countless human beings who have been in your classrooms, in your talks, who are now going to read your book, who are going to be inspired in that way. And there's just you, by you being you, you have opened up so much possibility. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Patty. Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
And congratulations on this really wonderful podcast. I hope all of your conversations are enlightening and inspiring to you personally, and then to all of the people that are lucky enough to listen to you in this new role. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for listening to What We Made Possible. I really hope this episode resonated. As a coach, I always end with action steps, and so I invite you to do something, which is to pause and ask yourself, what resonated? What am I taking away? And what's possible for me and my community now? If you liked this conversation, please leave a review and a rating. It helps so much. Thanks again.